Okay, moving on to the material I did not get to cover in class. Here we are at concept 23.3, or page 475 in the big book. And I just wanted to go over some of these points so you had my notes beyond just the slides. Okay, so from the part about Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, and that you needed 5 conditions required for a population to be in this non-evolving state, what we want to look at are the things that we generally do see in the natural world, and these are the things that can alter allele frequencies in a population. So the 3 major factors discussed in your text, these are things that change allelic frequency and bring about most evolutionary change, and these are natural selection, genetic drift, and gene flow. Differential success in reproduction results in certain alleles being passed to the next generation in greater proportions. And again, this comes back to all that we saw in the chapter about the Darwinian view of evolution, right? That there's overproduction, so there's competition, and what comes out of that competition is that certain individuals that have particular alleles that are best suited to that environment are going to be leaving more offspring. Well, that translates into certain alleles being passed on to the next generation in greater proportions. Now, the smaller a sample, the greater the chance that the numbers that you see would differ from what you would predict or what you would think would happen. So natural selection we're familiar with already. Genetic drift is going to be a new term for you guys. Genetic drift is a term that describes how allele frequencies will fluctuate unpredictably from one generation to the next. Because you're talking about, especially seeing this effect in small populations, genetic drift, random changes, tend to reduce genetic variation through losses of alleles. So not because that some alleles are more successful and you'll see more in progressive generations. This is something where you tend to see loss of variation through losses of alleles. And the animation listed on the bottom of this slide is one that's with with the media that came with your textbook. And it's a nice little display of talking about these causes of evolutionary change. So not just natural selection and genetic drift, but it is also going to get into a little bit more detail and also visual representation of these ideas. Okay, now they give you here a series of slides showing a starter population, generation 1, and you see the frequency of both the dominant allele, okay, the red you see is the capital R, the recessive allele, which is the capital W in the way they're describing it here, and then the heterozygotes, which, as you can see, have both characteristics. Moving to the next generation, if something came in that took out randomly some of the individuals of that population, you'll see a different frequency in the next generation. If such an event, again, this is not to do with how well the alleles suit the individual to the environment, it's just an event that takes out individuals. If the only survivors of that middle slide are the ones with the red flowers, then your third generation is only going to represent those survivors, just as the second generation represented the survivors from the first generation. So this situation where you're losing alleles, and again, typically we're talking a random cause with genetic drift. Okay, so let's say that was a field of wildflowers and someone just went stomping through it and just happened to step on everything but the individuals in the white boxes that survived. You're going to see these sharp changes in allele frequency. That was one of the exercises in the lab. The very first exercise, you had a big population, right? 72 pairs. But in those second exercise, you had a much smaller population, and you could see how you saw pretty radical changes in allele frequencies because smaller populations show more marked effects. Okay, so, and again, the numerical part at the bottom, again, there won't be a strong emphasis on this. You won't have to calculate these gene frequencies or anything like that. But you should understand conceptually the changes in allele frequency, if not having to actually calculate it in a numerical fashion.